Hello, and welcome to FI for Kids, a podcast about guiding your kids on the path to financial independence and extraordinary lives. I'm your host, Dominic Delacqua. Our guest today is Dr. Danny Brassell. Danny is a sought after speaker, author, and coach who helps entrepreneurs, parents, teachers, and leaders boost their influence and engagement through the power of well crafted communication and storytelling. He is a former inner city teacher and the co founder of the world's leading reading engagement program. So, we're going to talk today about the value of reading for critical thinking, communicating, and lifelong learning, all very important skills for parents and their kids on their journeys to financial independence. Welcome, Danny, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dominic. And more importantly, thanks for all the joy you're spreading in the world. I have no idea why financial literacy is not a requirement. It's like they get rid of the important things that you need to learn in school. It's ridiculous to me. So thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. We'll for sure talk more about financial literacy as we go. Before I dive into questions, though, I just wanted to add one thing of my own, which is before I earned my physical therapy degree, my first degree was an English lit degree, and to this day, it's still one of the five best things that I ever did because it taught me all those skills that I just mentioned. It taught me critical thinking, taught me how to communicate, and taught me how to learn. And those are things that I've learned that I've used in everything that I've done ever since. So the value of reading for all those things is so important. So I'm really looking forward to our chat today.
Great.
So why don't we start with you telling us about your background and how you became so passionate about reading?
Well, it's kind of ironic. I'm considered America's leading reading ambassador because I grew up hating reading, Dominic. My father was a public librarian. I always hated the public library. It always had uncomfortable furniture. It smelled funny to me. There was always an elderly woman telling me to be quiet. There's always some freaky homeless guy that thought he was a vampire hanging out by the shelves. I never liked the library. It wasn't until I started teaching in the inner city in South Central Los Angeles where I saw a lot of my kids didn't have all of the resources that I had available to me. And I basically said, shame on me. I mean, I was blessed, Dominic. Both of my parents were in the home. We weren't wealthy at all. We were pretty poor, but we always had food on the table. And my parents always read in front of us kids, to us kids, and we had plenty of access to reading materials. And so it became really important to me to really spread a joy for reading. I mean, I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, well, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read?
Yeah.
I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go turn on the TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to do it because they love it. And there's simple strategies. And you were talking about it in your background in English Lit. I mean, that's a passion that everybody should have burning inside of them, I think.
So let's talk about that then, since you brought that up, because that was one of the things I wanted to ask. Because some kids take to reading and pretty easily, and a lot of others don't, especially in this day and age when there's so many other, like you mentioned, so many other distractions. So talk about some of the techniques you use to help kids want to read, and what can parents do to follow through on that?
Well, there's lots of simple strategies. It was either Socrates or Keanu Reeves who once said, "You license to fish, a license to drive a car, but any idiot can become a parent." Well, now that I'm a parent, that's been proven true. But in parents' defense, nobody gives them a manual at the hospital, and so I always help parents with some simple strategies. With my own three kids that are grown now. You know, I create some habits early on with our kids. So I have a feeling that television's here to stay, and I don't believe in fearing technology. I try to embrace technology and use it to my advantage. And so the rule in my house, ever since the kids were really little, is they can turn on the TV, but the price of admission is they have to bring me something to read. So when they were little, they'd bring me children's picture books and we'd read the children's picture book. Then they could watch their show. Now they're all older. And so they'll usually bring me their iPad and we'll read an article or something they read in the newspaper or something. Another thing I do is I have dates with all of my kids and my wife with different books. And so my oldest daughter, she's in her 20s now. She likes George R. R. Martin, the Game of Thrones books. And so we've been reading, what's it, Fire and Ice.
Yeah.
Not my favorite. There's all kinds of there's language and situations I'm not a big fan of, but it gets her excited about it.
Sure.
My son loves anything with the military, so we're always reading some kind of military book. Right now, we're reading Mastering Commander by Patrick O'Brien,
Mm-hmm.
which that book, the movie's fantastic. The book, I think I have to take out my dictionary about 4 times per page because there's so many Middle English words. And then for some reason, my youngest daughter likes literature, and so we just finished The Great Gatsby, which I hate that book, but the more I read it aloud, I'm like, okay. F. Scott Fitzgerald, he knew how to put a sentence together. I just always hated the story.
Yeah.
And then my wife and I were reading this great series, the Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon. It's by this
Hmm.
wonderful, it just Beth Brower is the author. I have no idea why it hasn't been made into a movie. Really great female lead character, and these other guys in Elizabethan England. I had no idea I'd be enjoying that. But the whole point is the research is really clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. I'll give you an example. When I was teaching second grade, I had a little boy, Kiara, and Kiara's first grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. I'm like, well, thank you for that. Well, Kiara, who didn't know nothing, comes into my classroom one day. This is many, many years ago. And he's like, hey, Miss Brassel, you see Barkley last night? He had 18 points and 16 boards. I'm like, thank you, Kiara. Because from that day forward, every day after lunch, I'd sit him on my lap. We'd read the LA Times sports page together. And guess what? By the end of the year, Kiara was one of my best readers. All that kid
Yeah.
ever read about was sports, but I always tell people, the little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to be a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. I mean,
Yeah.
Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare, but we got to get the kid hooked on it first. And
Yeah.
so, really, what I'm always telling parents is, figure out what the kid's interested in and run with that. I honestly think, and this is just a theory, I've taught all age levels, but my favorites are the little ones. Well,
Hmm.
96% of kindergarten through second grade teachers in the United States are female. I used to watch the books that the teachers would introduce the kids to, and I don't believe it's conscious, but I think subconsciously a lot of women teachers are reading their favorite books to kids about bunny rabbits and things like that. Well, there's a great scene in one of I can't remember which Diary of the Wimpy Kid books it is, but Jeff Kinney, wonderful author, um, Greg Heffley's mother decides she's going to do a mother-son book club, and so she invites all the boys from the neighborhood to bring books, and they're going to have this book club. And the mother, she's brought like Little House on the Prairie, Anne of Green Gables,
Hmm.
Sarah Plain and Tall, and the boys have brought like How to Cheat at Video Games, the Book of Bodily Functions, Monster Trucks, and I'm like, that's
Sure.
and I know as a parent, you look at your kid and you're like, oh gosh, you got to be able to read something better than that. But if that's what they're into, people evolve. I had a little
Yeah.
boy when I was in preschool. Everybody thought he was learning disabled. I'm like, ask him about dinosaurs. That kid could list every single fact about the Stegosaurus. I'm like, read him dinosaur books. That's what's going
Yeah.
to get him interested. Why are you having Mark Twain said he was so excited when he graduated from college so he could actually start reading real books instead of literature. I mean, when I was in high school, I remember I had a high school English teacher, and she made us read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel
Oh,
Hawthorne.
yep.
No offense. I know you're an English lit guy. No offense to all the Hawthorne fans out there, but the book is basically Hester Prynne. She commits adultery, and so she's forced to wear an A on her chest. And I raised my hand in class, and I asked my teacher if I could wear a B on my chest because I was so bored reading that book. And if she was a good teacher, she would have asked me, well, what are you into, Danny? And I could have given her something and she could have just designed the whole unit around that. I mean, you're teaching the same skills, but at
Yeah.
least interested in it then. What I don't know why we have to read John Knowles a separate piece when a kid might be more interested in books about how to become a successful entrepreneur or something. Let the kid do that if that's what they're into. Figure it out. Again, I don't have research to support this, but I've always thought that the books that boys are exposed to aren't the kinds of books that they really like, and that's why we find higher literacy rates among girls
Hmm.
compared to boys. That's one of my theories.
Interesting. Just to back up real quick, the Scarlet Letter. So I actually really like Nathaniel Hawthorne's short stories. He's
Yeah.
got some really great short stories,
Mhm.
and I don't have a problem with the Scarlet Letter so much. But I actually had a bad teacher. She reminds me now after the fact of the beginning part of Dead Poet Society where Robin Williams comes in and he's reading from that book, and it's just she just robbed any sort of sense of
Yeah.
joy out of it. And so I sat next to a really good friend of mine, and we were both really into reading. That's kind of how we had connected actually in eighth grade. And this was in high school. We were in this class because we were into science fiction, right?
That's
So we were science fiction and fantasy, and we were avid readers at that age. and we sat in that class, and every day he would turn around because he sat right in front of me, and we would, that game where you have like pennies or three dimes and you shoot them, but that we would play that every day because we couldn't abide her. It was awful. So
Yeah, and you already said something. Is there's actually been studies that show that people that read science fiction are much more intelligent than other people. I always, especially in that age group, because that was the first book that actually got me interested in reading was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. It was the first book where I had to put it down because I was laughing so hard,
mm-hmm.
and it got me interested in reading more science fiction. Like the Robert Heinleins and Isaac Asimov and people like that. And so that's great. And what's even the other thing that you said, which was wonderful, is you had a buddy, and so you guys were able to discuss it. That's one of those steps a lot of people don't take, but it's really important to be able to. It's kind of like you watch a game; you want to be able to talk about the game with somebody else and recall what your feelings were during that.
Yeah. Well, and you give each other ideas and sort of keep each other motivated to do it. And that's not something that I've thought a lot about. Is that something that you have actively promoted in terms of trying to help kids want to read, is trying to get them to, other than just with their parents, have you worked on trying to get them to find friends that also read, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I listen to people talk about politics. I'm so bored. I like to talk to people about books. And so my seventh grade reading teacher was a guy by the name of Will Hobbs, who now is a best-selling young adult author. And Will was the first teacher to get me interested in reading because he had 5,000 books in his classroom library. And every day at the beginning of class, he would tell us what he was reading. We would tell him what we were reading. And the rest of the 50-minute period, we read. Whenever we finished a book, we go up to Mr. Hobbs. He'd put down the book he was reading, look through our book, ask us 3 or 4 questions. If he was satisfied with your answers, he gave you a point. Every book up to 200 pages was worth 1 point. Every extra 100 pages was worth another point. You needed 25 points to get an A. And the top 5 point totals had their names written on the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted my name written on that board. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, 500-page book, 4-point book. Also, an excellent Disney film starring James Mason and Kirk Douglas. I didn't really feel like reading a 500-page book, so I took the book up to Mr. Hobbs. He asked me 4 questions, and I learned a very valuable lesson that day. Books ain't always like the movies. And guess what he did? He gave me the 4 points. And that's when I learned a great teaching strategy. Guilt works because I read every word of every page of every book from that point forward, wound up with 44 points, went well above and beyond what I had to do. He used the single greatest strategy I've ever seen a teacher use to get a kid excited about reading. He found out what I was excited about. Football. And at least once a week, he'd come up to me and be like, "Hey, Danny, here's a book on John Elway. I think you'll like it. Check it out." What are the odds I open up that book? In my experience, all age levels, 100%. Kid might not read it, but they're going to open it. And also in my experience, by the 4th time I give a kid a book that I didn't tell them I'm thinking about him, they try and read that book. And the other thing that he used to do was every Monday, he did a book talk where he's like, Crazy Eddie, trying to get us interested in different books. And this really, this is the point I was getting to, is this is what really got me interested in reading. Is he'd show a book and a whole bunch of us would be like, that sounds cool. And then we kind of talk about the book and be like, "Oh, what chapter are you on? Oh man, you've missed this. This is like, what's going to happen next?" And it's that excitement that would build, and different strokes for different folks. I mean, like I was putting down Sarah Plain and Tall. Sarah Plain and Tall is a great book. It's not exactly my top book, but I know there's people that's like the greatest book they've ever read, and that's what I'm like. Let them talk about that, but. We force feed. It would be like telling every kid you got to eat broccoli for breakfast. And I mean, it's like, but I want eggs. No, this is the assigned curriculum is you got to have broccoli. And it's like, that's silly. There's nothing to prove that what you read matters. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I mean, I'm a big believer in reading positive things. I mean, the reason I started my book club was because I go around Barnes and Noble looking at the young adult section, and every book is about teen suicide, drug abuse, dystopian society. I'm like, no wonder teenagers are screwed up. Give them something positive to read. And so I believe you are what you read. So read good stuff. And us as adults, as parents, as teachers, we can influence kids by kind of pushing them in the right direction.
So before we come back to your book club, let's talk about that in a second. But so just to go through and summarize. So one of the things you mentioned, what you do with your own kids was having them bring you something to read, you would read it together before they turned on some sort of a screen, turned on TV or whatever it was. So it's kind of a little bit of a habit stack. So that's one thing parents could do. The other thing is know what your kid is interested in and then give them reading material that fits along those lines, right? If that's sports or dinosaurs, or it's Hardy Boys kind of mystery stuff, or if it's animals, or it's drama with friends, depend like if you've got teens, I mean, whatever it might be, give them those things. And again, like you said, right, they might not, I think that's great that they might not read them, but they'll open it if it's something they're interested in. And at least you're encouraging that and trying to get them to move forward. I can see how combining something like that with your habit stack idea really makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing, Dominic, well, I'll give you two things. Um, uh, First of all, you need to make reading the reward. I mean, I love the Book It program sponsored by Pizza Hut, where kids get rewarded. The more books they read, they get to eat pizza.
Hmm.
If I ran that program, it would be exactly the opposite. Every time a kid came into Pizza Hut and got pizza, I would reward him with a book. You're sending a very different message to the kid that the reading is the reward there. And so, and I actually have a case study on this right now. I'm in Dallas coaching clients, and a friend of mine, we went to a Cowboy game last year, and he had two sons, and he was griping about they weren't reading. And I said, we'll make reading the reward or whatever. We went to a Cowboy game this year. Cowboys lost again. But he was like, Danny, you're a genius. Like my boys, they love Friday nights because if they've been getting all their homework done, we take them to Barnes and Noble and we get them a comic book. Or and I'm like, heck yeah, you did it. And his boys, they used to hate reading, now they love reading. They used to have academic problems, now they're doing fine in school. So that's one thing. And then another one, this is probably the most popular strategy I share with parents all the time. President Bush Sr. signed a very important law in America many years ago that said every television set sold in America has to have closed captioning. So one of the first strategies I share with parents is turn on the closed captioning. And people say, well, wait a sec. If the show's in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? I'm like, well, that's a good point. Let me make a point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles?
Yeah.
Very difficult to do. Your brain's actually directed towards the text. And there's actual research that supports this. If you look at reading scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every single country on the planet except for one. The country where kids watch the most TV also has the highest reading scores on the planet. It's Finland. And people always ask, well, how can that be? I'm like, well, because Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they have to do is they have to import all these American sitcoms like Good Times and Welcome Back, Kotter and everything. They translate them into Finnish. The kids are reading all the time. One of the simplest strategies anybody can do, get the closed captioning turned on. I mean, again, I've actually worked with parents that don't know how to read, and I can teach them how to get their kids to be able to read. And it's always fascinating to me because the kid finally figures out their parents can't read. It's all about excitement. You want to build up that excitement so that the kid's not doing it because they're forced to in school. They're doing it because it's a real pleasure. I mean, your English Lit's stuck with you. You're excited about reading. You'll read lots of different things, and that's the greatest thing about me for reading now is I'm a very eclectic reader. If somebody tells me something's good, I always check it out. I don't always like it, but and I have another habit I teach people is if you don't like the first chapter, maybe give it a second chapter, but then put it down. Get another book. I can do this. I'm a PhD. That for everybody listening to this podcast that has that 800-page book on your bedside table that you started 3 years ago, I absolve you of that book. Get another one. There's over 4 million books written in English every year. Some of them are pretty good. Don't waste your time on a lame one. We're taught to finish what we start. I mean, that's stupid. It's like, if you take a bite of something like, oh, this is nasty. Well, maybe it gets better. Oh, no, it's nasty. I mean, the same thing with a book. If you don't like the first chapter, you're probably not going to like the second chapter. Put it down, get something else.
Yeah, sure. Well, and sometimes, right, it's just the wrong time and place for you, and you may come back around to that book later and be like, oh, this didn't work for me before, but I like it now. Maybe not. And also, you made me think of something just talking about all these different books and recommendations and checking things out. One of the other things about that is that's that joy of discovery, right? Because we all like to discover something new, whether it's we look forward to new movies that are coming out, or you discover a new TV show and wow, this is really great. And that same thing is true for reading, right? That same thing is true for books. So finding new things and a new great story, because story is just so engaging and we all love story, even if we're not thinking about it as such. It's just so important and so central to who we are, because we all tell ourselves stories, right? That's how we sort of navigate our way through life, is we have these internal stories about ourselves and about other people's, and sometimes that can create some strife, but understanding that and being able to adjust that and navigate that for yourself is also how you move towards a more fulfilling, successful life, right? I mean, and to some extent that was one of the central ideas of Joseph Campbell's, right, with the hero's journey, which is all these myths that go back hundreds or thousands of years. They're all telling the same basic story, which is you've got to find your own path and create your own story. So that idea of discovery, I think, is also really important.
Wow, I hope you transcribed this podcast. That was so beautifully put. I loved so many points you just made there. My favorite one was the first point about just because you don't like something now doesn't mean 20 years from now you won't like it. I mean, you live in different stages of life, and
Absolutely.
what was it again? I'll quote Mark Twain again. He said when he was 18, his parents didn't know anything, and when he was 21, he couldn't believe how much they had learned in just 3 years. There's books that I hated as a child that I love now as an adult. I was bragging to my kids how great Superman 2 was, and recently we watched Superman 2. I'm like, this is the stupidest movie I've ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah. We did that recently with a couple of movies over the course of the last year that, oh, I loved them. I'm like, ooh, this is pretty painful. Like, wow. Yeah, sometimes it works the opposite way, but
That's right.
so let's into the FI world. So if parents and are pursuing their journey to financial independence and they're trying to teach their kids and get them started early, let's talk about how reading benefits them on that path.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is gonna you're gonna hear my beefs with the education system. I mean, this country's crazy. We graduate kids from high school knowing calculus, but they don't know how to balance a checkbook. I'm not putting down calculus. I think calculus is great, but you should know how to balance a checkbook. We don't offer enough of those practical things. And I think that's why so many people are intimidated because they don't understand it. And the reason they don't
Mm,
understand it is they weren't even exposed to it. And that's one of the things I love about reading. There's so many of these great authors, even children's authors. Lorraine Leedy, she writes all these math-oriented books. Many of them are financial literacy books,
mm,
which it gets you excited, gets you curious. Like, oh, what's a stock? What's compounding interest? What does it mean to buy and hold?
yeah.
Are concepts that kids should learn at a very early, and they should be excited about them. Again, we always fear things we don't understand. Once we're exposed to them and we are exposed to them again and again, then we become very comfortable and we're like, okay. And that's how you help people navigate. I really think that most of the financial problems in this country is because people just don't understand some of the basics.
So let's talk then some more about financial literacy. Because
Mhm.
that's such a big topic, and I completely agree with you. And we've got some other episodes where we're talking about financial literacy and just how important it is, and how much it's lacking. And I mean, there's a lot of things that play into that. Some of it is there's a whole societal zeitgeist, I guess, sort of in this country in a lot of ways where you're not supposed to talk about money, or people don't think they're supposed to talk about money. But also, right, there's a knowledge gap, like you said. And I think you bring up a great point in that a lot of the stuff, at least the basics, are not really that complicated.
Yeah.
But if you don't know even the basics, anything can seem overwhelming and complicated. And the more that you start to learn those basics and start to grab a hold of those, then as you learn more, you can like, oh, now I get it. And you start to see the connections between things. And then the whole thing starts to make sense. And then you can really sort of take off. So what are your thoughts about how parents might use reading to help move their kids towards financial literacy as well as just literacy in general?
Yeah, I mean, you can totally gear the conversation all the time. I mean, this is great. This is what a good teacher does. You can just take the newspaper, take current events. I mean, you can look at, I'll take my boys. When I was a teacher, I'd be like, man, why is it that Patrick Mahomes is making more per snap of the football than I'm making as your teacher?
Mm-hmm.
And get them thinking about. I'm not putting down Patrick Mahomes at all. He deserves
Yeah.
every penny. He's given me lots of pleasure watching him. He's an artist as far as I'm concerned. But I want kids to understand. Well, let's look at that. This is finances. Now, why is it that there was a great ESPN documentary called Broke, where the statistics were ridiculous to me. It showed that over 80% of NFL football players file for bankruptcy within 3 years of their retirement. Like,
Yeah.
my gosh. These guys, Evander Holyfield made $500 million, and the guy filed for bankruptcy because he didn't know how to manage his money. He
Yeah.
surrounded himself with people. I mean, and it's not just athletes. You hear about this all the time. I mean, I'm reading biographies of all kinds of famous people. You look at the Bernie Madoff saga, where a lot of intelligent people invested with a guy that was running a Ponzi scheme, and I mean, even Eli Wiesel, I think a Nobel Prize winner,
Hmm.
was scammed on that. And it's like, well, how do intelligent people let that happen? And so I'm always teaching my own children. I'm like, well, I don't invest in things I don't understand. If I want to invest in them, I have to educate myself on them. So I love real estate, and so I teach the kids, well, this is what I've learned about real estate because it's a tax write-off, but it actually appreciates over time, and I get a dividend in the form of rent. And the kids are like, oh, the kids get excited about that. We can go through the newspaper and go through stocks. I'm like, okay, Nvidia right now is just going crazy. Now, is there anything that could put Nvidia in danger? I'm like, now this is it. This is important. I teach people. I'm like, hey, the 30 stocks that are in the Dow 30, the top 30, those 30 stocks, I think none of them were in the top 30 50 years ago.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, let's look at, well, what's a safe bet over time? I mean, maybe Johnson and Johnson isn't a sexy stock, but it's been around for 200 years, so there's a track record. Whereas, you know, this other investment might not be
Yeah.
such. I don't know enough about. People are always trying to get me to invest in cryptocurrency. I just have no understanding of, and I'm not putting down cryptocurrency. It might be fantastic. I
Yeah.
just don't understand it in any way whatsoever. And until I feel like I have a solid understanding, I avoid it. Now, I could be potentially costing myself a lot of money. So that's a perfect example of a person that's not informed, that's costing themselves money. So this is the type of thing that I think families need to have these conversations all the time. I mean, generational wealth. My parents, we moved like 25 times from the time I was born to the time I graduated high school. Well, every time we moved, there's a lot of cost involved. And so if they had just stayed in San Diego in their house that they paid like $40,000 for, that same house would be worth $2.5 million.
Yeah.
I mean, it was all kinds of moves. Those are the types of things. Well, where, you're investing with this person and they're taking a flat fee at the beginning and they're taking a lot of your possible profit. Do you need that person? So I think these are important conversations and I love it when people disagree with me. To me, that's good. That's good dialogue. We should be able to disagree. This is probably the biggest problem in America right now. People, they demonize another that they disagree. I'm like, disagreement's the basis of our democracy. You just have to listen to one another. You don't have to necessarily agree, but you do have to learn how to listen respectfully. And I try to listen respectfully, especially. It's kind of funny because the people we're training right now, they're into mineral rights,
Hmm.
and I'm learning all kinds of tax benefits from selling a house and exchanging it for mineral rights. There's all
Interesting.
kinds of tax benefits that I didn't realize. So it's a lot of fun. And so I think that's what you have to do as a parent or as an adult, is to show your kids your own curiosity. And if you don't know something, well, let's investigate together.
Yeah, that's good. And I think too, I see the connection between just when they're younger and not necessarily interested in reading financial stuff, most kids, like you said, get them reading whatever it is that they're interested in. And if they learn to read, then when they get older and they want to know more, they want to sort of investigate things, then they're able to be comfortable with reading and use that as a tool to learn practical things, right? I mean, so we talked a lot about kids that were younger and just reading whatever they happen to enjoy, but there's a point at which you also, as you become an adult, there's a lot of benefits to just continuing to read fiction and things that you enjoy. But some people really like to read biographies or whatever it is. But also there are times you just like, I want to know about, if you wanted to know about crypto, right? You could go, you could get some books. You could also go online and there's, right? Because reading isn't just books. So there's also, I mean, certainly there are some videos you could watch, but there's also a lot of information online now where you can read through things. So you could learn about crypto if you felt like, well, I want to know how this works. And you can do that with anything. So being able and comfortable with reading I think is so important. And any sort of thing when kids are younger to get them moving in that in along those lines, then makes it easier for them to take advantage of improving their financial literacy, because again, that's not something that you do once. You learn the basics, but you're learning stuff right now that you didn't even know that was out there to learn. And so because you're having these conversations with people, but there it's being able to read in order to continue to educate yourself about whatever it is you might be interested in is a lifelong pursuit, or should be, I think.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing you said I love is that you can blend fiction with nonfiction as well. I mean, I learned a lot. I mean, it was Walt. I love poetry, and Walt Whitman said, "Be curious, not judgmental." And
Mm,
probably one of my greatest strengths as a teacher, and probably as a human being, is if I don't know the answer to a question, I say I don't know, and I'm interested in pursuing an answer to that. All these people fear artificial intelligence right now. I think artificial intelligence is incredible. I think it's going to have dramatic positive effects on. Obviously, there's potential for negative effects, but there's positive effects as well.
yeah, absolutely.
You know, my favorite thing about artificial intelligence, and hopefully people will get this point, is having the answer is no longer as important as being able to ask the right question. It's the same
Mm,
with finances as well. Are you asking the right question? I've had a lot of people say no to things I've asked. And I believe that the people tell you no, they're just not important enough to be the person who can tell you the answer that you're looking for. The more I pursue with questions, and I've learned this with AI, I'm like, it's not understanding me. How do I make myself more clear? How do I
yeah,
speak its language? What a wonderful skill is how do you learn how to have relationships with people where you're learning how to speak their language, not just your language.
yeah,
It's the you know, everybody talks about the golden rule. I like the platinum rule. The golden rule is do unto others as they would do unto you. Platinum rule is do unto others as they want done unto them. You need to figure out, well, what makes this is what it takes to be a good teacher. Is you'll have 33 kids and all of them are different.
yeah.
You're trying to figure out what's the gasoline to fuel the fire for each of these kids.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and true for parents too, right? Parents with multiple kids, every kid has a different personality, and that continues to change, and what gets through to them or what resonates with them also shifts as they age. So that same thing is as totally true as a parent, I think.
Well, Bill Cosby said, unfortunately, the older I get, all my idols turn out to be scumbags. But Bill
Yeah,
Cosby used to joke that if you only have one kid, you're not a real parent because you know who did it. Anybody has multiple kids, you realize, man, how are all these kids from my own DNA? They're all complete. I have three kids. All three of them are completely different, have
yeah,
totally different interests. They were all bred under the same house. So when people say, is it genetic or is it environmental? I'm like, I have no idea, but I know that they're all different. And my job as a parent is to figure out what they're into and to help them pursue that interest.
yeah, yep, absolutely. So you do training with executives, parents, entrepreneurs on using communication and the power of a well-crafted story to either benefit them with more customers or with their employees or whatever it might be. So talk a little bit about how that works, and then let's tie that into how can parents use that concept to teach their kids.
Yeah, actually, the structure that I always tell people this is the structure I teach them on a speech is the same structure you could use to communicate with your kids. I call it the 5 C's approach. So it begins with clarity. So when I'm working with entrepreneurs and executives, the first thing I say is, well, do you have clarity? There's 2 questions you have to be able to answer. And if you can't answer them, you're in trouble. Those questions are, who is your audience and what is the problem that you solve? Now,
Right.
even the people I'm working with today, I'm like, who is your audience? And the guy says, well, it's men, executives. Well, they can be from Texas, but we can also have them from the West. And they have to, well, they don't have to. I mean, it took him a minute to tell me who he was serving. I'm like, until you know clearly, then you're
Mm,
going to have trouble with this. And I said,
yeah.
well, what's the problem you solve? And same thing. He's like, well, we do this. And it took him a minute to answer it. And I said, I'm like, okay, let me demonstrate. When people ask me, what do you do, Danny? I say, I help individuals, entrepreneurs, and organizations leverage speaking on stages as a major client lead source that converts. It took 10 seconds.
Yeah.
I've practiced that thousands of times.
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
this is And it's the same with a good speech is, so clarity is your first thing. Now, when we get into the structure of a speech, it's the same thing as a parent. First of all, you have to connect. Then you get into the content, the teaching, which is actually the least important. And then you end with a call to action and a close that gets the person to do whatever it is that you want them to do. This is how you introduce yourself to new people. This is a speech you're going to give again and again. Politicians they
Yep.
called that a stump speech. If you
Hmm.
watch superhero movies, it's always the origin story of the superhero.
Right.
In Start with Why, his book, Simon Sinek, I think, would probably call this a visionary statement. The structure is the same. I mean, we say, you connect, you teach content, you have a call to action, and then you have your close. Those all start with C. So it's the same structure all the time. And so I'll give you an example. So about 3 months ago, we were working with a team of financial planners, and one of the guys, Richard, he started off his speech by listing off his credentials. He's like, "Well, I've been in the industry for 30 years. I've made my clients over $1 billion. I've worked with these different famous people." And I said, "Richard, that's great. This information is important, but you're putting it in the wrong part of your speech. At the beginning of your speech, the most important thing is to connect with your audience." And so we just changed a little bit of Richard's presentation, where now he talks about the very first client he ever had to get. And it was basically a comedy of errors. He made so many mistakes. It's amazing that the guy actually signed with him. And Richard said this, it was interesting because the way he gets clients is he does these presentations to about 15 people at like steak restaurants, like once or twice a week.
Hmm.
And he said he used to get about 6 out of the 15 would set up an appointment with him. And usually the woman seems interested, and the husband always has his arms crossed, like, "What are you trying to sell me?" And he said, now 2 weeks later, he did our new speech that we put together for him. And he said, now that same guy, he's leaning forward, he's patting his knee because he's laughing so hard. And he said he booked 12 out of 15 in that
Wow.
group. The reason he did that is because you were able to connect. And so if you're a parent, you talk to your kid, what you're doing is you're trying to connect with the kids, see it from their point of view,
Yeah.
teach a short lesson. Now, this is important to understand is the bun's actually more important than the burger. The research shows that people remember the beginning of what you say and the end of what you say. They don't remember anything in between. So your
Hmm.
content's actually the least important. And then you end with a strong call to action, which hits two types of needs, is what we talk about. I call it the Joe Fridays and the Julia Roberts. So taking the example Richard gave, if you have a married couple, the guy's usually Joe Friday with his arms crossed. He's like, "I just want the facts, ma'am. How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take me? What am I going to get because of it?" So you have to make sure to accommodate that person and talk about all those things.
Sure.
If you only address that, you're ignoring Julia Roberts. Julia Roberts is usually the woman who she doesn't really care what you're selling. She just wants to feel good. Does it make me feel good? Does it make me feel positive? And if you can address both of those needs, you're now hitting 100% of your audience. Most people tend to favor one or the other, and they're ignoring half of their potential audience. So again, with your own 3 children, or however many children you have, you would understand what is it that drives this person and really focus in on what is their motivation.
Sure. So as an example, right? So let's say you have a teenager wants to get a car, right? So that's then maybe your way to connect, right, as a parent. And that leads you into some conversations about, well, finances and how that works, because now they're motivated to understand that. And then a conversation about, well, if you maybe they need to get a job and they need to bring in more income, or maybe they've already got a job, but they've got to adjust their spending. They've got to make some different decisions and change some habits around so they can start setting money aside in order to get that car. And that then becomes a way to expand the conversation about savings and spending less than you make. And this is a lifelong habit because then you can take that money and invest it and so on and so forth. And then the call to action might be, in this case, right, because they're motivated about, well, I want to get a car, is to, okay, help them figure out how much they're going to start setting aside in savings and how long it's going to take. So
Yeah, absolutely.
something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my youngest daughter, she wants me to send her to college in New York City. I'm like, that's not happening. And I said, this is why it's not, because when I went to school and I started connecting with my own story and then said, these are the things that I had to do. And so if if you want me to pay for your college, you're gonna have to show me that you're a responsible person. Literally within a couple of days, it was amazing. She's like, "Well, I'm gonna get a job at Starbucks, and because I'm at Starbucks, they pay for education through Arizona State University. I'm gonna get my bachelor's degree through Arizona State, and I'll be able to save this much money." And I'm like, "You sold me. I'll put you in fashion school in New York City if you're able to go through with that plan. And I'll be proud to do it. Frankly, I don't know if a college education is worth it anymore." I'm like, "But if you really want your kid to go to Harvard, here's what Harvard or Stanford, I would say, is if you go to community college for 2 years and get your AA degree and have at least a 3.5 GPA, community college for those first 2 years is going to cost you, we'll say, I'll go really extravagant and say $15,000. It's not going to cost that much, but
Hmm.
let's say 15. I mean, states like Tennessee will actually pay for it, so it's free
Hmm.
for anybody from Tennessee. It's a great program. Everybody should be like that. So you get your AA degree. So your first 2 years of college are usually general education units. All these reports ranking colleges like US News and World Report, they're ranking it based on incoming freshman class. And then the other ranking that's important to them is how many people graduate. None of these universities have to report transfer students. And so it's very difficult to get into an Ivy League or a tier one school as a freshman. But if you can show them that you had a 3.5 GPA at a community college, you've now proven to them that you're a serious college student, and
Right.
they know that the odds of you graduating are very high, which is going to help their ranking. And so you are much more likely to get in. I actually have a friend in Singapore, and that's what he does for a living. He gets all these Asian students that weren't able to get into the schools that they want, and they take online AA degree classes, and then they transfer into Berkeley and University of Texas, North Carolina, all these great tier one schools. I went to the University of Southern California for my PhD. If I went there for 2 years, I mean, it cost $85,000 a year. And it's not even the most, that's
Yeah.
very average now for the top tier university. So 85,000 a year. So that's 170,000 for those first 2 years. Let's say community college cost me 15,000, and then I gave the kid 10 grand. Well, that's a total investment of $25,000. 170 minus 25 just saved you the down payment on a house. Like, these are the choices I think people need to make too. Then I think people are starting to figure this out, is maybe I don't have to go to the university. I mean, plenty, you already talked about it with reading. It's the same thing with your education. There's so many possibilities available
Yeah.
online now.
I hear more and more people talking about, I don't know, the college is worth it anymore for my kids. So you may be onto something there, because it's a theme that I've been hearing more and more over the last few years.
And again, I'm not putting down college. There's all kinds of benefits to it, but I also think that you need to have the conversation. Do the pros outweigh the cons anymore? I don't know if that's true anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it depends sort of what your field of study is going to be and what your end goal is. But again, that's back to sort of financial literacy. It is a financial decision as well as an education and an ongoing sort of career decision. And you've got to look at all of that together and balance that out. And then it kind of comes back to being able to sort of read and find out what your different options are, and also having conversations with people, right? Whether that's kids that are trying to decide what to do, having conversations with their parents, or other adults that they know, or having conversations with people in fields that they're interested in, and learning what that's like, and learning more about what their options might be. So
That was well said, by the way, Dominic. I mean, one of my mentors was Charlie Tremendous Jones, and he said, "You're the same today as you will be in 5 years, except for two things: the books you read and the people you meet." So make
mm,
sure you read lots of good books, and make sure you surround yourself with people that know what they're talking about.
yeah, no, it's so important, so important. um So before we cover, I want to cover the different places where people can find you and your websites and whatnot. But before we get into that, any other thoughts that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I think, well, first of all, you're doing a huge service with this. I think it's really important that your listeners listen to this podcast all the time. I get all kinds of great tidbits, and you're attracting the right people. I mean, I was watching a horrible show on TV the other day called The News, and it just totally put me in a bad state of mind. The reason I read positive books and I listen to podcasts all the time, like, this is the answer. These are the solutions. I'm sick of being confronted with problems all the time. I need to be around people that are looking at solutions and giving practical strategies. And so I commend you for giving practical strategies. And as a thank you to everybody listening to me, I actually, it's funny because I'm like, oh, I can give you 2 different websites, but I just told you only have one call to action. So I'll make one. Since we talked more about reading than speaking on this podcast, I want to give everybody a couple of freebies. So if you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book called Read, Lead, and Succeed. This is a book I wrote for an elementary school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation, demonstrates the same concept. You read that in 5 minutes. And then I'll give everybody access to a 5-day reading challenge I did online last summer for about 700 parents around the world, where every day for an hour, I'm giving you all kinds of strategies to help your kid read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. Because the more excited we get kids to read, the more likely they are to read. And the more you read, the better you get. You get all that free story, freegiftfromdanny.com.
Okay.
Wrong site. Freegiftfromdanny.com. You'll get all that. And again, I just appreciate all that you do, Dominic, and you keep on doing it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. I'll put that in the show notes so people can just click on that. Thank you so much, Danny, for coming on. It's been a great conversation, so I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FI for Kids podcast. Please support the show by hitting subscribe and receive new episodes every Thursday. The intro and exit music this episode are courtesy of Douglas Cameron. As always, you can find links to the FI for Kids music in the show notes. Thanks again, and we'll talk next week.
You're like the horizon. I can't reach you, you're so far away. And if I run to the place I want you to stay, you'd be gone. I'd be left wondering why you moved on, and why you never said goodbye. I can't wait any longer. I see the writing on the wall. It's time for us to say, tomorrow we are yesterday. Tomorrow we are yesterday. You're like the sunset. You're glowing bright, but you're fading. And what I don't get is why I'm left here waiting. But I'm like a phoenix. I will rise up from this fire. It's something we can't fix. I guess it's time for us to retire. I can't wait